Chapter 29. Evenings used to be nerve-wracking. Lord Antony would be preparing to go out, and Eiji would wonder whether his master was going to be gone all night, or whether he would bring Lord Marcus or some other lover back to the room. He was never sure whether he should go to his pallet in the god's room, or try to curl up in the closet as best he could manage. Now, evenings were the best part of Eiji's day. No matter whether he or Lord Felix got back from their labors first, they invariably ended up together in the sitting room. Lord Felix in his chair and Eiji kneeling next to him on the pillow the god always insisted on, leaning into his master's legs as Lord Felix stroked his hair and they talked. On this particular evening, Eiji felt ready to melt into the floor with contentment. They had their rest day tomorrow, which made it all the better. Perhaps Lord Felix would spend some of the day here, with him. Perhaps they would kiss some more. Perhaps Eiji could finally gather enough courage to... "I'd like to ask you for a favor, sweetheart." Eiji nearly fell into his master's lap. He was so excited to look up into his face. "Yes, my lord?" "There's your lovely face." Lord Felix beamed down at him and stooped to press a kiss to his forehead. "I need some air. I'd like to take a walk on the deck, and if you're willing, I would love it if you came with me." "I would be honored, my lord," Eiji agreed at once. It did sound nice. Zenji made sure to send all of them to the upper deck from time to time, but Eiji still didn't get out into the fresh air as often as he had when he belonged to Lord Antony, and there was nothing to do but wait for his next chance to go above. Moreover, it would be bliss to take a walk with Lord Felix. Hell, from his place a few steps behind the god, he might even get the chance to sneak the sort of lascivious glances he wouldn't usually dare to allow himself. Lord Felix stood, then held out his hands. Eiji took them, feeling the little zing of excitement that always shot through him at even the slightest contact, and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. His master dropped another kiss on his forehead once he was standing, then one on his left cheek, quickly followed by his right, and finally the very tip of his nose. "Sorry," the god breathed, half chuckling as he wound an arm around Eiji and hugged him close. "You have a very kissable face. I can't believe how lucky I am that you let me touch you like this." Eiji's cheeks burned. Hell, his whole body burned. "This is it. I could say, 'My lord could touch me much more than that,' or 'May your servant touch you,' or maybe..." Those were all too bold, too much. He finally settled on the slightly less staring. "My lord honors his servant. Every part of me is entirely at my lord's disposal." It was still more brazen than he was entirely comfortable with. His hands shook and his heart thudded so wildly that he could feel his pulse in his throat as he waited to see how Lord Felix would answer him. Since he had been so bold, he felt that his master really ought to respond by throwing him back down to the floor and ravishing him with wild abandon. It would be only fair. Instead, the god's smile dimmed and he stepped back. "No ravishing, then?" "There's no part of you I would dispose of, dear," Lord Felix said. That wasn't how Eiji had meant disposal, and the god knew it. Frustrated, Eiji bowed his head so his master wouldn't see what he feared was an unforgivably sulky expression. Lord Felix must have caught a glimpse anyway, because he bent over Eiji's hand and kissed his knuckles. "I'll meet you by the door," the god said, then disappeared into his room. "It's windy tonight, so you'll want a wrap." Eiji grabbed the wrap as suggested and slipped his shoes on, still feeling a little sullen. His mood improved, however, when his master returned in a heavy coat, beaming with excitement. "This is going to be lovely," Lord Felix enthused, pulling on his own boots. "I feel like I haven't taken you on a single proper courting activity. A walk in the moonlight is long overdue." Eiji smiled back at the sight of his pleasure, but he was still a little confused. "Courting activity, my lord?" "Yes, dances, walks, Lord Felix shrugged, ducking his head, then opened the door and gestured Eiji through to the hallway. To be honest, I'm not sure what people did back home other than that. I was too young for courting when I left my village, and of course no one at the capital would have deigned to court the likes of me. He hesitated. Perhaps that's not fair. Antony did marry a human servant, so I suppose it's not right to say that they all thought I was too far beneath them. Suffice it to say, I didn't really attract that kind of attention. Edgy's head was spinning as he trailed the requisite 3 steps behind his master down the hallway. Lord Antony had been married to a human? And some group, presumably the gods, had considered Lord Felix beneath them? Of course, he'd mentioned mystifying things before, like being hungry, eating human food, and working the land, but Edgy had never seen any indication that the other gods saw his master as anything but an equal. What did it all mean? Most bewildering of all, what did Lord Felix mean when he said he didn't really attract that kind of attention? That was impossible! He was the most gorgeous person Edgy had ever set eyes on. Even if all the gods were blind, they would still hear his kindly words and feel his strong arms. How could anybody, god or human or anything else, fail to respond with adoration? Lord Felix was either mistaken or lying. It was disrespectful to think that his master was wrong, but Edgy didn't think Lord Felix had ever lied to him, so he would just have to accept that he was going to be a little disrespectful. Edgy had to wrench his mind from this maelstrom of confusion when the god continued speaking. And there isn't much to do on this boat that's terribly romantic, of course. We all improvise as best we can, but I still feel that I'm shortchanging you. What would you like to do? I want you to tear my clothes off and take me like a wild animal. Thankfully, another god walked past just then and saved Edgy from having to come up with a more appropriate answer right away. Lord Felix greeted him as Edgy knelt, grateful for the reprieve. Hello, Livius, his master said. I don't believe you've met my attendant, Edgy. Edgy, this is Livius. Edgy bent lower and murmured, It's an honor, my lord. The other god laughed. Dear Felix, you're still absurdly indulgent, I see. If you didn't spoil them so much, you'd probably enjoy them more and take one on more than once a century. Well, have a good night. He walked away, still chuckling. Fucking prick, Lord Felix growled. Edgy didn't think the other god had walked far enough to miss the insult. He also didn't think he'd ever heard his master swear like that before. What had Lord Livius said that was so wrong? Surely Lord Felix knew that he was behaving strangely when he introduced his slave, like the other gods should take notice of him and remember his name. And Edgy would be the first to agree that he had been spoiled outrageously since Lord Felix claimed him. Come on, sweetheart, get up, his master urged. I'm sorry Livius was so rude. You'd think 1,000 years would be enough time to learn some manners, but apparently some people need longer than that. The god's obvious ire made Edgy uneasy, and he knew his movements were a little slower than usual as he rose. It took an effort not to cower. He didn't think Lord Felix was angry at him, but what did that matter? If he chose to take out his ill humor on his offering, that would be well within his rights. When he tried to think rationally, Edgy knew that such an outcome was unlikely. Lord Felix had never punished Edgy for anything he actually did wrong, let alone as a way to vent his anger over unrelated matters. But even if he knew it probably wouldn't happen, the thought that it could kept Edgy tense and on the verge of cringing as they resumed their walk down the hallway. They went on for a few more steps before Lord Felix said, his tone no longer irritated, You know, this would be a lot more romantic if we were holding hands. But, my lord, your servant could not presume. Edgy faltered, stopped, and cursed his stammering tongue. Why was he protesting? He loved the idea of holding Lord Felix's hand. but he'd been taught so carefully how to behave in public, and the thought of simply ambling along at his master's side, like he thought they were equals, made every inch of his skin twitch uncomfortably. "Easy, sweetheart, you don't have to." Lord Felix sounded guilty, and his shoulders hunched a little as he glanced back over them to peer into Eji's face. "It wasn't an order." An order. Before he could think better of it, Eiji appealed. "Please, my lord, couldn't it be?" Lord Felix stopped and turned to face him. "Oh gods, oh fuck, he's angry. And he should be. Eiji was being demanding and disobedient. When his master had expressed a desire for him to do something, he should have just fucking done it. Wasn't that what he always wanted? A clear idea of Lord Felix's desires? The god had been generous enough to hand Eiji a chance to please him on a golden platter. And what had he done? He'd been selfish and allowed himself to get caught up in his own stupid, irrational fears. Who cared if an unworthy, used-up slave like him was frightened to break protocol without an explicit order? It was his job to do as his master wished, not to do it without ever being scared. Eiji tried to kneel at Lord Felix's feet, but the god put a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him upright. Tears burned his eyes, and he was mortified to realize that he might cry in the hallway, in public, for everyone to see. "I'm so sorry, my lord. Your servant is unbelievably presumptuous. Please punish me as—" Eji's gabbing was silenced by a careful finger tucking a stray hair behind his ear. "Easy, sweetheart," Lord Felix soothed, and immediately Eiji wanted to collapse against his broad chest and be enfolded in those powerful arms. Now that he knew how good it felt when his master held him, it was like an addiction. "I didn't mean to frighten you. It's all right. Would you feel better if I ordered you to hold my hand? Would that make it easier for you?" Eiji drew in a shuddering breath. "My lord is more generous than I deserve. I did not mean to place conditions on my obedience. Of course not. I am yours to do with as you please." "That isn't what I asked." A gentle kiss on the crown of his head eased the sting of the reproof. "Would it make you feel better?" "Yes, my lord," Eiji whispered, closing his eyes so he wouldn't have to see all that undeserved kindness. "All right." Another kiss on his forehead. His master was being so generous with his tender touches tonight. "But I warn you, I'm going to feel very silly about this. Give me a moment to try to say it in a way that doesn't make me feel like the world's biggest prick." Eiji took the moment gratefully, staring at the wall over the god's shoulder and praying that no one else would come by before he could compose himself. "This is a pleasant outing, a courting activity even. I mustn't spoil it for him. Why can't I ever just enjoy a good thing?" "Eiji," Lord Felix intoned after a moment, his voice strangely pitched and accented. "Jewel of Taisha, I demand that you hold my hand as we take a walk in the moonlight, or I shall draw a rude picture of Zenji and claim you did it." He finished the command with an over-the-top evil chuckle, the sort of flourish one of the priests used to use when reading villainous speeches and bedtime stories. Eji's whole body went loose and soft at the sight of his master clowning for him, and he couldn't help joining in. His first laugh was a little shaky and soggy, but when he finally took a breath and dashed the tears from his cheeks, careful not to smear his makeup, they were mostly just laughter. The churning in his stomach and his brain had eased. He finally dared to raise his eyes to the god's face, and found that Lord Felix was smiling that soft, dazed smile he always wore when Eiji laughed. His master extended his palm. "Take my hand, dearest." Eiji had never been so happy to obey an order in his life. They continued up to the deck hand in hand. Eji's heart pounded as they reached the top of the stairs. The other gods were about to see his presumption, but instead of an immediate outcry, or even the anticipated moonlight, there was just a cold, damp wind that hit him like a physical blow. It cut right through his thin wrap, and he found himself instinctively shrinking against Lord Felix's sheltering bulk. "It's even windier than I thought," the god said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the gale. "Are you all right? Should we go back?" "No!" After all the problems and drama Eiji had caused on the way up here, he couldn't simply turn around and scuttle back to his master's rooms, not even if his robe was getting soaked by the ocean spray. "I'm fine, my lord," he insisted, getting a mouthful of salty breeze for his stubbornness. To his astonishment, Lord Felix let go of his hand with a quick squeeze and shrugged out of his coat, then held it out to Eiji. "Your arm?" the god prompted, and Eiji obeyed unthinkingly. Lord Felix smiled as he slipped the garment over Eiji's limbs. It settled heavily on his shoulders, its hem brushing the deck on him, where it had hit just a bit below Lord Felix's knees. Whatever material it was made of, it immediately blocked out the worst of the chill. "But, my lord, what about you?" Eiji managed as the god set to work rolling the sleeves up to uncover his hands. "I don't really feel the cold, sweetheart," the god replied cheerfully. "I only brought it in case your wrap wasn't thick enough. I just wish I could have warmed it up for you." Once Eiji's hands were free again, Lord Felix reclaimed it, and they set off walking. "You never did tell me what you would like to do together," the god said after a moment. "I know it's cheating to ask you to instruct me how best to court you, but I suppose I'll have to live with the shame of cheating. What would you like us to do together?" "Anything my lord chooses to do with his servant is a greater honor than I deserve," Eiji replied promptly. Lord Felix's shoulders sagged, and he looked out at the dark tossing waves, no doubt to hide an expression of disappointment. Eiji's gut twisted. He shouldn't make his master so unhappy. Lord Felix didn't deserve that from him, especially not tonight, after all the kisses and the coat and the hand-holding. "Rokuro taught me how to make noodles," he said in a rush, before his nerves could get the better of him. "Your servant very much enjoyed the night we made bread together, my lord. Perhaps we could do it again? Or noodles, if my lord prefers?" Even in the darkness, Eiji could see the dazzling smile his master gave him. He felt warm right down to his toes, no matter the wind and spray. "That sounds wonderful," Lord Felix said. "Absolutely wonderful. Thank you, sweetheart." Eiji couldn't help preening a little. He might not know why he was able to make his master so happy by being presumptuous, and he might not always have the courage to do it, but it was so rewarding every time he mustered the will. "What would you like to do tomorrow?" Lord Felix asked. "Any plans?" "Plans, no. Desperate daydreams, yes. Your servant hoped only that my lord might choose to honor me with his presence for some part of the day." "Of course I want to spend the day with you, if you're amenable." Lord Felix squeezed his hand. "But I also wanted to ask you about that, if you don't have plans of your own." "Yes, please, my lord. I beg you to command me." Gods, he sounded like a child begging for dessert. Lord Felix pressed his hand again. "It's a question, dear, not a command. I know our last get-together with the others ended with some difficulties, but I wondered if you might be willing to try again." Oh, that wasn't the sort of favor Eiji had been hoping for at all. In fact, he'd been dreading this eventuality ever since the failed game night. He'd known that sooner or later his master would want to reinstate the tradition, but even though this was certainly later, at the moment it felt an awful lot like sooner. Still, he really ought to have a better attitude about this. It was a chance to redeem himself. He could chat and laugh and do his best to relax. He could find more ways to be demanding and presumptuous, risking punishment for the chance of watching his master light up like this again and again. And if anyone suggested he sing, he would stuff a pillow down their throat.